I need one of those Tosna Life shirts, man.
Yep, you're there.
They're $18 on meadmaderight.com. I'll look you up since you're giving me product placement in this video.
Yeah, I like that.
You're good, Billy.
That's really gonna be an
Dakota
example of sweet clover.
Clover.
Yeah. It's gonna be a record sweet clover crop this year in South Dakota.
Yeah, we'll get into honey varietals too. That is a fantastic one. Oh, this is delicious, Sergio. All right,
Thanks.
let's get started. So, welcome everyone here at Lost Cause Meadery and online on Modern Mead Makers and the Mead Made Right crew. Welcome to Advanced Mead Making Discussion. And first, before I do intros, happy National Mead Day. Yeah. Cheers, guys. Oh, this is going to be really easy to drink, Sergio. All right, so joining me is Sergio Moutela and Carvin Wilson, both mead makers that I really respect as colleagues. Sergio has been instrumental to the entire mead industry, but also helping a lot of us as meadery owners get started. So a lot of us are in debt to him. And same with Carvin, who's given up more time and effort over the last few years than anyone to advance mead making across the country, across the world. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, but thanks for being on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you. Let Sergio go first.
Your name is alphabetically first. I don't know. But all right, I'll go first. So yeah, I'm Sergio. I own Meadery Meadery. I'm currently the president of the American Mead Makers Association as well. So yeah, we've just been we became New Jersey's first meadery about almost 5 years ago. To celebrate our 5-year anniversary this September. We've just been experimenting, having a lot of fun, trying to push mead to any limits we could see that we could break, basically. Just constant experimentation
and just making a really great product.
I still literally feel like I'm a home brewer, just with like way bigger toys, essentially. That's kind of how I run the business, and that's what keeps it fun still every single day. So that's a little bit about me and what I've done with Melavino.
All right, well, my name is Carvin Wilson. I'm a beekeeper, mead maker. I brew beer, I make cider, I make wine. I'll try to ferment just about anything that I can get my hands on. I'm always going to be a home mead maker, never going to go commercial. I love hanging out with these guys. But if I want to give away money, I'll just have more children.
It's a good way to do it.
Thank you for having me on, Billy.
Awesome. All right. I'm Billy Beltz. I'm the owner of Lost Cause Meadery here in San Diego. I've been trying to, kind of like Sergio, do whatever we can to play around with pushing the boundaries of what mead can be. And I'm really proud of the meads we're making now. And yeah, thanks to everyone for being on. We're stoked to be here. So I also want to mention that this event is being put on by Mead Made Right, which is Sergio founded. It's a community online and resources for mead makers, and it's really become the go-to spot for modern mead making practices. So this video is being recorded. It's being streamed live on Modern Mead Makers group on Facebook, and then the recording will be moved to Mead Made Right, so people will be able to watch it on the Mead Made Right website. Anything else about Mead Made Right you want to plug?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, you broke up there for a little bit, but yeah, no, everything will be on meadmaderight.com there. We got a weekly podcast, and
the Tosna calculator obviously lives on the site as well, and yeah, looking forward to finally starting to have to have this video of like advanced mead making techniques, basically, to stream live anytime
website.
On the website.
So that'll be pretty cool.
Awesome. Also put on by the Society. which is us, right? Yeah. Group of mead geeks and fanatics in San Diego and Southern California. So if anyone out there is ever in San Diego area, come to a meeting. It's a lot of fun, and we geek out on everything mead about once every other month. So, all right. Let's see. Looks like we got a lot of other mead makers and meadery owners joining us, which is rad. We're going to get some good questions today. We've done this before with different people or different groups, and a lot of times we'll spend, we'll start at the beginning, which is usually a good place to start, and go through fermentation, and then geek out on fermentation for way too long and all the things that you can do. And then we have just a little bit of time at the end for after fermentation adjustments. And so Carvin put a poll up on modern mead makers to see what people wanted to talk about, and it was really after fermentation, big thing by a landslide. So I guess that means, Sergio, that your Tosna is working and everyone's making perfect mead. So now we just gotta help them tweak it afterwards.
I have gotten plenty of emails of husbands, married men who have said that their wife actually isn't bitching at them at spending so much money on wasting good honey anymore. So yeah, it works. It works.
Sergio. All right, so let's kind of Benjamin Button this thing where we'll start at the end and then go backwards. So let's say that we're going to focus on after fermentation adjustments. I want to start with traditionals. We'll get into the other stuff soon enough, but starting with a traditional mead, you've taken all the steps to keep your yeast healthy. You've used the highest quality honey, highest quality ingredients, so you have this really beautiful, delicious traditional that maybe you want to tweak, need some more something to balance it out. Maybe you're going for a different flavor or aroma profile. You want to push it there. There's a lot of reasons to adjust a traditional afterwards. So I want to start with you guys. You get done with fermentation, you racken it into something else, and then what do you look for? Where do you go to figure out what you want to do next? And they're frozen. Or they're really thinking hard. Did one sec, guys. What do we need to do from here? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
And it froze again.
There you
Okay.
go.
All
We're
right.
good.
All right.
It's California.
What'd you guys hear?
You want us to start talking about trads and what we do for trads. So we're going to talk about after fermentation adjustment for traditional meats. Okay.
Are you still on cellular?
Can you hear me?
Okay, it looks like they're back.
Yeah, we're back.
All right. Let's try this again. Carvin, go.
Okay, one of the things I like to do with my traditionals is, of course, make sure that you're using a honey that's going to stand out. But one of the things I like to do is I ferment all my traditionals dry, and then I choose a gravity that I want to back sweeten to. One thing I want to point out with a good traditional, for me, I think it's important. Alcohol is not your friend. ABV is not your friend when you're dealing with varietal honeys. Alcohol destroys ester, so keep that in mind when you're making a good traditional mead. One of my friends in after fermentation adjustments for traditionals, I love medium toast French oak cubes. I usually do that first for a range of 24 to 72 hours before I make any kind of acid adjustments, because sometimes I feel like that gives me just enough tannins in that mead for me not to have to do an acid adjustment, which is something that I go to if I feel that oak does not give me what I want. And one thing that I also stress a lot with traditional meads, carbonation is your friends, especially if you're entering competitions. I feel that when you have two meads side by side, I think that carbonation puts it over the edge, especially in a competition. So those are some things that I like to use for a traditional mead. I'll let Sergio go next.
Yeah, I'm more, I can't really say I'm a purist because I throw stuff like marshmallows and graham crackers and other weird stuff into meads. But as far as when I normally ferment something, I normally like fermenting something to end, to finish where I kind of want it to be. Once it's done, I don't want to mess with it. So I kind of normally take that approach and try to design every recipe that way. But sometimes, there's certain ingredients that I would only add in a secondary. So there's certain, like obviously spices, or like I just mentioned, graham crackers, for example, peppercorns. Like we're literally drinking a pink peppercorn session mead right now, right? Stuff like that is when I'm going to end up adding it to secondary. Other than that, I try not to do any adjustments like acid blends or tannins or anything like that. And that's just me. It works tremendously well, and I've had plenty of meads that are adjusted and played around with afterwards. But for me, it's mainly just what ingredients am I going to be adding to that mead, which normally in my case I kind of know going in, and I'll normally basically tailor the honey selection to that particular recipe. So let me see. As an example, we just did a collaboration with the local brewery to release this weekend. So we did we basically made like a honey lemon Kolsch shandy at the brewery, and we wanted to turn it into a parallel collaboration and do like a lemon Kolsch style mead, but make it kind of like lemon shandy kind of a thing. So I knew going in that I'm going to want it to finish this certain way. I want it to smell, look, and taste as much like a Kolsch beer as possible. So I know I'm going to basically choose a blend of honey varietals that is going to get me that final result, right? From there, it's basically the yeast, fermentation temperature, and then obviously how much lemon or lemon juice do we want to put in there? Like what form or forms, plural, of lemon do we want to add in here to really kind of get that lemon shandy quality afterwards too. So for me, a lot of it comes from just thinking about it in advance and getting to where I want it. But then as far as secondary additions on a traditional, you could go so many different ways. For me, like I said, it's normally, when we're talking about that, it's normally spices. Sometimes there's some fruits depending on.
Hold on, Sergio. Lost you.
Oh, the California.
That it? We couldn't hear your California crack, Carvin.
There's California internet. You guys regulated that too.
Funny how you said California and crack in the same sentence.
Comes the New Jersey guy in.
Speaking of crack, I'm going to touch on something that Sergio just touched on in regards to traditionals.
Yeah.
Well, when I'm making a traditional, using Benjamin Button, I kind of go backwards too as well. I know if I have a certain honey, whether I want to use different fermentation tannins in primary, whether it be FT Blanc, FT Rouge, FT Berry, FT Citrus. So I'll target whatever honey I'm using, think about what I want the final product to be, so far as mouthfeel, so far as aroma, so far as tannins. And I try to, as much as I can, based upon my experience, tannins and other polysaccharide agents in primary to give me that finished product that I'm going to be looking for, to where when I back sweeten it, 9 times out of 10, I really don't need to do acid adjustments. There are times when I will pull that out of my tool belt, but 9 times out of 10, I'm usually just putting a little oak on there to just finish it off. And then, I'm usually done with my traditional meads at that point. And
yeah.
That combo has won me a lot of medals.
Nice. All right. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I rarely do acid adjustments.
You guys froze up a little bit over there.
Oh, I did? Back?
Oh, all right. Can hear you now.
Yeah, I'm with Carvin. I don't do...
Maybe not so much. You guys froze up again.
Yeah, it's California.
So now we're freezing. Well, if you're doing Wi-Fi, got... Yeah, but we could tell our Wi-Fi off. Just unless you have a family member about to go into pregnant, everything on there. All right. Oh, we really lost him. All right, we're back. So we're good?
If this keeps up, Billy, we're going to go through a lot of mead, and we're going to be through in about 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's all right. It'll make it more interesting. All right, so I was saying I'm with Carvin. I really like tannins and tannin adjustments in a traditional much more than acid, especially depending on the honey varietal. Even if you are going for a super sweet traditional, but it's a meadow foam or a buckwheat, there are certain flavor profiles I think you add acid maybe to balance the sweetness, but then it just doesn't fit with the flavor profile. Whereas some of the citrus blossoms, it actually does work a little better. But we try and do it all in primary, and then depending on how it turns out, we really like finishing tannins, and that's separate from any oak any barrels we're putting into, or oak that we're aging it on. I just love some of the Scott Labs, their Lux finishing tannins. They're fantastic, I think, for traditional meads. And whatever it says on the package, I usually double it, because they're talking about, dry red wines. They just need a little adjustment. A semi-sweet traditional mead's a whole nother thing. So, all right. How about any tricks for balancing? Well, let's say any tricks for repairing a mead that maybe had some sulfur in it, and you get it out in traditional, or you get it out in secondary, and there's still some remnants of some SO2. Have you guys used any of the Scott Labs products to fix that, or any tips or tricks for adjusting for that?
Yeah, I mean, post fermentation, I think it's pretty tough to get the hydrogen sulfide out of there. Yeah, I think Scott Labs product is Regulus or something like that. Redless. It's a copper-based product, in a powder form, but I haven't used them myself. But yeah, it is a little difficult to get out in secondary. I mean, obviously you're going to want to try to prevent any of that that sulfur from even occurring. I mean, by paying attention during fermentation. Gassing during fermentation helps prevent that. Kind of helps, not prevent it, but it helps basically off gas it. At least you have a chance before you kind of hit your 1/3 sugar break to kind of really whip up your mead and try to get that to air out. And make sure you got your proper nutrient additions in there so the yeast stays happy and doesn't keep producing that for you.
Okay. We lost you again, Sergio. It's whatever you think. Everyone should be off it.
Move out of California. Get better internet. Probably T-Mobile.
Yeah, you guys got a couple of towns in Arizona that have internet connection, right?
Well, you know what? It's better than California. At least we haven't disconnected on you. Okay.
Yeah, you're the tech guy. I feel like you're just messing with it.
Oh, if I wanted to hack you, you wouldn't even be on right now.
All right. So anything else with traditionals? I wanted to bring up, I don't know if you guys were in Eric Lowe's presentation 2 Mazer Cups ago, where he took a dry traditional mead, gave it out to all the attendees and added a little bit of acid and then a little bit of tannins, and you could see the progression of how it improved, how it got brighter, and then how you got more structure in it. Anyways, I thought that was fantastic. And I remember he was saying about, he does it for all of his traditionals. It was like 0.5 to 1.5 grams per gallon of tartaric acid, and then I forget the tannin adjustments. But it was just fun to see the progression from a clean mead, but kind of dull, to a mead with some structure and brightness to it.
Yeah. So go ahead, Billy. I'm sorry.
No. All yours.
Okay, before I answer that question, I want to go back to the SO2 because I didn't get to finish. I got 2 recommendations. 1, there's this invention called the sink. Dump it. 2, give it to your kids or people who don't know any better. As you're putting out something that represents all your hard work. Don't give people crap, dumb crap. Just be done with it and start over again.
Not only that, you're also representing mead overall, right? Mead is still one of those beverages where it's not like beer or wine. Everybody's had a bad beer, everybody's had a bad wine. But if one person has one bad mead, they write off an entire beverage category just like that. Yeah. So there's a saying in the homebrew world that I learned years ago. If something that I made, if it's good, I'll give you a bottle. If it sucks, I'll give you 2.
Yeah. Don't make shitty meat. There's enough shitty meat out there already. Don't make shitty meat. And if you do, don't serve it to people. Okay, on to the acid question. First of all, Eric loves acid. He's like the ambassador of acid. In general.
That is true.
And acid does have its place. And it was wonderful to be in that presentation because you can take something that's already good and make it better if you do acid trials. There's so many documents out there already. I'm not going to go into how to do that process. But if you got something that's cloy and just bland on the palate and it doesn't pop, acid does wonders. And more importantly, also does something for the aromatics of the honey. And I think that gets lost sometime. I think that acid actually helps the aromatics of the honey a little bit too as well. So it definitely gives it a little bit pop. It definitely and here's my thing about mentioning acid. Anytime you have a podcast and someone says to do something, I go to judge comps and everything's like too much acid. I could like put a stamp. So like everything, it has this place, but you got to trust your palate and make those adjustments and see where they go. But don't get too carried away with it. It is a tool, just like the Lux Tannin, just like oak. You just got to put that tool in your toolbox and know when to use it.
Yeah, and it's I've been saying it for years myself too. It's when in case you don't know, it's like, a lot of people will just automatically jump to use an acid blend, which I always used to hate and I never really understood like its real purpose. For me, it's I've been saying it for years, and I think slowly, little by little, it's been catching on, and which I'm glad. People are stopped using acid blend as much, and they focus on using the individual acids or a blend of their own, essentially. So what I mean is, acid blend is normally comprised of 3 different acids, right? You've got your tartaric acid, normally comes from grapes. You've got your malic acid, normally found in apples, for example, and then your citric, right? But most acid blends are normally, at the very least, 50% citric. Sometimes they're 60 or 70% citric acid. So why are you going to want to throw in like citric acid into something that's made from honey or something that's made from like a grape piment, for example, where tartaric acid is mostly found, or
That?
Did we lose you?
Yeah.
No, I can hear myself when I'm in.
One sec.
California internet still sucks.
It's
this is the ginger Kolsch, by the way.
all right. I think we're back. Hi, Robin.
Oh, you can see my wife in the back.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'll move. I didn't realize that.
No, you can stay. You look better than me and Sergio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing you, Billy.
You too. So Carvin, actually, you brought up a great point. Acid does have an effect often on aroma, and I've actually seen it go both ways. Bring out the aroma and kind of mute it. So bench trials,
Absolutely.
bench trials also with Sergio's saying the type of acid. We've found some, they're not traditional meads, but some fruits do really well with all malic acid, which we rarely use, but like for some reason watermelon worked great with malic acid. Normally we would use tartaric. We wouldn't have found that out if we didn't do bench trials. So
Absolutely. And that brings up a great point. A lot of people get stuck on tartaric acid. When you're doing bench trials, you should do all the acids. Just don't get that mindset, and even mix them yourself. 20% tartaric, 20% malic. Play around with those ratios yourself. Not all acid blends. The acid blends you get from your home brew store, yeah, they suck. But the ones that you can create on your own, you can create something that's very special. You can come up with your own acid blend for a berry melomel that that could be like one of your trade secrets right there.
nice.
Yeah. Pretty much.
So let's move on to outside of the traditionals, and we'll get into melomels and methaglins and the weirdamels. So start with melomels. I know that Carvin, you're a big proponent of fruit at all stages, depending on what you're going for. How do you approach adding fruit in secondary? If it's just to add a little bit of a fruit note to it, or if it's to really emphasize something. What's your approach to fruit in secondary, and what are some tips and tricks?
Well, I'll say definitely for whole fruit, use bags, number one. Yeah, I mean, I don't use a whole lot of whole fruit on the commercial side. If I had the right tanks for it, I probably would use a lot more. If I was still a home brewer, it would just be easier to use whole fruit all the time, actually. But when we do use whole fruit, it's normally, in secondary at least, it's normally because we want to get like full fresh fruit character. Because obviously you put it in primary or even halfway through fermentation, that fruit is going to change, and you're going to get that fermented fruit wine character rather than that fresh fruit. Unless you start with 12 pounds of fruit or 8 pounds of fruit per gallon, kind of a thing where no matter what you do, there's always going to be so much unfermented component of fruit there. But I mean, adding it into secondary, I mean, Secondary is so much easier to add stuff into in most cases because you can add a little bit at a time. I mean, it's like, it's like basically trying to, I don't know, fix up your car and throw a spoiler or throw some rims on your car. It's a lot easier to do that stuff when the car's not moving down a highway, like as if you were going to be trying to add fruit during the fermentation, right? Because now you're trying to work with a moving target. So adding fruit in secondary for me has always been, a little at a time, trying to get the right ratio of fruits. If you're working with different fruits, you also have to keep in mind what's your specific gravity, what's the final gravity on that mead, because depending on what you really want to get out of that final product, and this is what I think it really comes down to. It all comes down to what you want out of the final product is really going to determine what you end up doing. So if you want something that's really big and fruit forward, then you kind of have a better idea of how much fruit to add, so it doesn't lose the honey too much. But if you want something that's more honey forward, you need to kind of go a step at a time and make sure you don't overdo the fruit. Handling wise, I was always as much as I hate using mesh bags, I just have this thing with using mesh bags. I still use them whenever possible, just because it's just smarter to do. It's way easier to rack your meat out. Process for adding fruit into secondary.
Do you sulfite your fruit before you add it into?
I do not.
Yeah, me.
No.
That's a question that I get a lot. That's why I wanted to ask Sergio. Do I sulfite my fruit before I add it in after primary? And I don't. So if folks don't know, I'm the home meat maker. These guys are the ones who are losing money, Billy and Sergio. So my approach is different when it comes to fruit. As Billy stated, I will add fruit all throughout primary fermentation. I am a big fan of tasting your mead. I drink a lot when I'm fermenting. And I know what profile I'm supposed to have at a given time. So if I'm lacking that profile, I will just add more fruit, keeping in mind that I could potentially be changing the ABV of that mead depending on how much fruit that I'm adding. I am also, if I have just like a fruit bomb, like those Midwest sugar belt people like out there in Michigan and that part of the world. If I got like a fruit bomb, but it tastes like fruit, but I don't have the aromatics that I need, I will definitely add more fruit in after primary to give me the aromatics. And I think that's where secondary helps me. Secondary fruit additions helps me more than anything. I got the taste that I want, but I'm missing those aromatics. So I'll throw some fruit in secondary to give me the aromatics. Another trick that I was telling Sergio that I use a lot is you always got those people who's like, I can't pick up the honey. So what I will do with a big old fruit melomel is I will use a distinct floral honey to where they can pick that honey up on the nose of that big fruit meat. Something like a sage that is extremely floral. And that way you'll get people, it's like, I get the honey and I get the fruit.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, we're very much we have very much the same approach with fruit and secondary, where a lot of the time we're doing it to get the aroma that we want, and bring out all the other fruit that's been fermented in primary. And sometimes it's just a tiny bit. Sometimes it's a little more. With strawberries, we've found that at least half the fruit in primary is great for getting that fresh strawberry flavor or aroma mixed with that deeper fermented strawberry wine type flavor. But also it depends on the fruit, right? So, berries and darker fruits are really going to be great as a fermented fruit, whereas citrus and other fruits where no one's drinking lemon wine, but adding lemons in secondary, zest and some juice is fantastic. So it also depends on the fruit, which is why we don't believe in all in primary or all in secondary, or just a rule to stick by. So some of the fruits that you guys have found to do better in secondary than primary, what are some of them? What are some actual fruits?
That's tough for me. I mean, I think so many mead making questions. Sometimes for me, it's like the perfect answer is, well, it depends what you're looking for, right? So, I mean, there's certain recipes we add all of our fruit in primary. There's some recipes we add all of the fruit in secondary. Some recipes we added in both. So it really all depends on what you're going for, essentially, right? I never really kind of thought about it in a way of which fruits work better in primary or secondary, because again, it really all depends. So if I want to make like a raspberry mead, for me, I have always been in the camp of I want to taste the fermented form of raspberry with the fermented form of the honey. That's just how I kind of got into mead making, and that was my whole mindset of making more almost like wine style meads. Not necessarily dry, but everything fermented. But again, it really all depends, right? So if there's something that I want the fruit, like let's say for example, like we made a raspberry cheesecake mead here at Melovino, and I knew that I wasn't necessarily going for a fermented raspberry character for a raspberry cheesecake type of theme. So I knew our customers were definitely going to be looking for raspberry cheesecake. So we're going to add the raspberries in secondary, or at least actually we added more in secondary. We still fermented a little bit of it, but we added most of the fruit in secondary, so you get that fresh.
Hold on, Sergio. We lost you for a sec.
Okay.
It's
All right,
okay.
you're back.
It's California.
You're back.
Yeah. So in other words, I mean, my last sentence there was basically, it really all comes down to what exactly you're looking for in that recipe, right? Whether or not to add it in primary versus secondary, rather than what, for me, it's, I think about it that way versus what works better in primary versus secondary. I normally think of recipes like individually. What am I going for this recipe? And nothing else matters. What I do with other recipes no longer applies. I'm thinking, how am I going to execute getting this as the final product on this actual recipe?
Yep.
And nothing else matters from that point on.
It sounded like you were saying
gonna-
raspberry cheesesteak mead, so.
Cheesecake, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh yeah, you guys didn't hear that part. Yeah, so the example I gave was we made a raspberry cheesecake mead, and I knew
Still
that our
sounds like
customers weren't going to be looking for a honey raspberry wine with vanilla and graham crackers.
Right.
They were going to be looking for raspberry cheesecake. So we knew that we were going to be adding most of that fruit in secondary, so you get that fresh raspberry brightness rather than just a fermented form.
Yeah.
I don't know how much you missed, but my point is I look at each individual recipe rather than just overall process. My process will change from recipe to recipe, depending on exactly what I'm trying to get out of that final outcome.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to chime in here, Billy. A couple types of fruit I always use after primary: dried fruits like dried figs, dried apricots, dried bananas, dried dates. I always like to use that after primary. I find that you get a really good both flavor and aromatic profile with that. I also like to use strawberries a lot after primary. But one thing that I want to point out is I split the fruit a lot. And I say that is because I'm always going for layers of flavor and complexity. I hate when someone says that I'm all primary, I'm all secondary. I'm trying to create an experience from the minute you pick up that glass, from when you smell it, fore palate, mid palate, back palate. I want that same consistency all the way until that meat gets into your stomach. So I'm trying to create an experience. And sometimes you can't create that experience if you just limit yourself to say, hey, I'm just going to do this. So always keep that in mind. And one thing you also have to understand when you're using whole fruit, just like honey, just like grapes, fruit changes from year to year. So you're not always working with the same type, the same level of peaches or strawberries or apricots that you got last year. That's where I think the guys who have to concentrate actually do have an upper hand. I think that product is a little bit more consistent from a commercial standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You can duplicate those meads, but as a home mead maker, just because you got the figs from your neighbor last year doesn't mean you're going to get the same profile from those figs this year. I've seen that time and time again, even from the same vendor that I bought fruit from, that fruit profile changes. So, I think on a commercial level, using the concentrates and using a vendor that you trust is going to give you reliable stuff. Your product has to be the same. I don't want your meat to change from year after year. And I think that brings up something really important for the commercial guys. But from on the homestand front, you got to understand that fruit's going to change from year to year unless you got a fruit garden out back. And even then, you're still going to have some variation.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, even with literally one batch of fruit, you could get so many different results, right? It doesn't even have to be year to year, season to season. I mean, when we make, like when we use pineapples, for example, we make a particular session mead where we have a grilled pineapple and cinnamon session mead. And we know that when we get those pineapples, we cannot just buy them, slice them up, peel them, slice them up, and put them on the grill. We need to wait until they're at the perfect ripeness, right? If they're too green, it's too astringent, it's too acidic. If we wait too long, which we've done once, then all of a sudden it's just too sweet and too flabby of a pineapple taste. But if we basically wait until the pineapples are in the perfect state for what we want to get out of them, where we get that pineapple sweetness, but they're still get into that final product, we need to wait until that difference.
Okay. So let's get into spices and other ingredients. I'll kick this one off. I feel strongly about this. When it comes to spices, don't think cinnamon is just cinnamon, right? Or cacao nibs are just cacao nibs. I mean, it's just like hops. A brewer would never just say, "Oh, go grab me some hops. We'll throw them in because it calls for hops." No, what kind of hops? When are you putting them in? And that all of that makes a huge difference. So what we've found as we've gone down the rabbit hole with certain spices is it makes a world of difference if you start looking at origins, kind of like coffee. You're going to have beans from South America that have a much different flavor profile than the higher acidity and fruitiness of beans from Africa. Same thing goes for vanilla, cinnamon, everything else. So my advice on using spices is always think about what you want and then start to really, investigate that ingredient. We've found even it's how you use it. So cinnamon, if we want more of the spiciness and the aroma, we'll use a certain blend of Ceylon and Cassia cinnamon and then put it all, just dry hop it basically, put it right in. If we want more integrated flavor, we'll actually throw the cinnamon sticks into a pot, boil them for a minute, and then put them in and put the boiled water in. And it actually integrates and you get the cinnamon around for much longer. The flavor stays around for much longer, we've found in our experience. So you got to test some things, but really kind of geek out on any ingredient you're doing and realize that, there's a lot of variation between where it's coming from and kind of approach it like a chef. I guess is what I would suggest. What have you got? Any tips and tricks for spices?
No, that's a really good point. Actually, I've always been very into the culinary scene. I've always cooked a lot, and one of the things I always notice is I'm way better in mead making than I ever was in brewing beer, just because it's so much more akin to cooking. Brewing is to baking as cooking is to mead making, kind of a thing. So yeah, it's very much so, very in line with cooking. It's you got to learn what flavors go with what, and how to handle and process certain ingredients to get what you want. Right? You know, how many ways can you cook a potato? You know, I'm Portuguese, so you know, in Portugal, there's a saying: there's 1,000 ways to make codfish. Right? We eat codfish like at least 3 times a week. But there's like 1,000 different dishes that you can use with just codfish. So how you prepare and how you handle an ingredient, just one ingredient, could give you so many different variables. But yeah, adding spices. One good tip that you mentioned, cinnamon, is I don't know, for whatever reason, I always preferred like giving myself extra work and headaches of having to deal with it afterwards. But for whatever reason, I always preferred using ground cinnamon versus cinnamon sticks. If you're going to go the ground cinnamon route, there's one tip that I can kind of give is if you were to just measure out your cinnamon and add it to your mead, all it's going to do is just float on top and stay dry. Cinnamon does not really dilute into your mead, right? It's a ground spice, so it's not going to go anywhere necessarily. So one trick I've always done, I still do to this day, whenever I use cinnamon, is I actually I pull some of the mead out into a glass or sanitized container on the large scale. We use like a big stainless steel vessel, and huge stainless steel measuring cup basically. And what we'll do is we'll actually take like an immersion blender and just beat the crap out of the ground cinnamon into the mead. And we let it sit for a while. We hit it with the immersion blender again, and we pour it right into the mead itself. So what that ends up doing is kind of like it disperses the cinnamon all throughout. It'll actually kind of like settle down into the mead, and then it doesn't necessarily end up just floating on top. It kind of gets all throughout. So that's one tip as far as using ground cinnamon, or really honestly any ground spice at all. Especially the more if it's in just pure powder form, that'll just float on top. That's one way that we were to consider scaling up your batches or going commercial, and you need to scale up your batches. Spice.
Hold on, we lost you, Sergio. Or anything? Okay, got you back.
All right.
Requirement for next year is lease an OC3 for an internet connection to have a Mead Day podcast.
Done.
Okay, on that note, so a couple things on spices for me from the homebrew guy. Let's start with yeast. Sometimes yeast gets in the way of your spices. So decide whether you want to get a yeast that complements the spices or just use a neutral yeast to get out of the way of the spices. And the same thing with the honey. Choose a honey that's going to complement the spices, or choose something neutral that you want to highlight the spices. With that said, don't be afraid to use spices in primary and use them after primary fermentation is done. So once again, I am trying to create layers of flavors, and I find that putting spices in primary is like a taboo thing, and I'm a rule breaker, and I like to break rules. So I find that you get a different complexity by adding spices in primary by just adding them and secondary only. You get. I find that once the spices that I put in secondary goes away, still taste remnants of what it tasted like after primary. So I can tell the difference between what I added in primary and what I added in after primary. And I find the ones that I put in primary stay in a taste profile a lot longer. So make sure you play around with your yeast selections when you're using spices. And once again, if the yeast isn't adding anything, try just using a neutral yeast so it can get out of the way of the spices. Sometimes people use yeast that throws esters that are counterproductive productive to the spices that they're using. So take that in mind.
Are there any particular spices that you have found you end up doing more in primary, or is just trial and error?
I say most for me it's trial and error, Billy. But once again, if I'm going to make a spice mead, at least lately, I'm putting them in both primary and secondary. And I want to give a shout out to I call him the Spice King, John Talkington. I've learned so much from using spices and the proper application of using spices from that guy. I've been telling him for years he needs to come to the Mazer Cup or MeadCon and do a talk on spices. So hopefully next year we can get him there. I think he makes some of the best spice meats around, and we need to pick his brain. But for me, Billy, the question is easy. I use them both in primary, and if the profile isn't what I need, and normally it's not, 90% of the time it's not, I'll add more after primary fermentation is done.
Okay, cool. One other thing, piece of advice I like to give on spices, specifically chili peppers, is get to know your chili peppers, especially ones used in cuisines like Mexican cuisine, where there's so many different chili peppers that have great flavor without crazy spice, so that you can use, what we do often is we'll use 3/4 of our chilies will be anchos or pasillas or something with not a lot of spice, so we can get that depth of flavor, and then 1/4 of a spicy chili, and that's just one way we've found to get a lot of flavor without making it undrinkable. You guys have any other recommendations on chili peppers?
Go a little at a time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Be very careful with them. And we had a question on Facebook, so we want to let those folks know that we're looking on Facebook too. So someone asked, how do you use teas and meads?
Yeah.
90% of the times when I'm using tea in a mead, I make tea. So if I'm making a 3-gallon batch, I'm making a 3-gallon batch of tea, and I choose to ferment it that way.
Oh, we froze.
Once again, I'm trying to create layers of flavor.
Okay. So, Sergio, are you ever using teas for spice additions at the commercial level? Well, I don't know if you can hear me because it froze. Yeah. 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 All right.
All right, we can hear you again. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
There we go.
So we just had a question from our audience about using tinctures. We haven't done a lot of that. You guys had much experience with using tinctures to just maybe fine tune spice in a mead?
I have not. No, never really messed too much with tinctures at all. If I needed more of something, I would literally just add a little bit more. I don't know if you've ever done tinctures at all or mess with it on a normal basis.
I don't mess with it at a normal basis, but it's something that I have in my toolkit to where, if I need it. One of the things I like to do with tinctures is I'll make a little honey water must, and whatever ingredients I'm trying to extract at that point, I'll put them on the stove, cook them down a little bit. Then I'll use that liquid to I know a lot of people swear by it. I know my good friend Josh Mahoney, and he uses a lot of tinctures. At least last time that we had a sober conversation, he said that he did. But it's definitely something that I think that you can get a lot of flavor out of if it is done correctly. So that's the thing. When you're using those tinctures, that flavor is concentrated. You need to, just kind of like peppers, you need to be very careful that you don't overdo it.
Yep. Okay. We got one more question. Like fresh herbs. Great. So we just had a question about using fresh versus dried. An example would be ginger, or between different herbs and spices. Are there any ones you've found that have worked better as a either fresh version or dried version?
I mean, I'm gonna go out on a limb and just say fresh is always better. We're literally drinking a mead that I made with fresh ginger. I would never be able to get that with dried ginger or even candied ginger, which I've used plenty of times in even like session meads. You're never gonna get that real nice ginger character unless you use fresh. Herbs as well, especially I think even more so in herbs. I mean, if you cook, you know the difference between dry basil and fresh basil, right?
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. I mean, it's night and day. You can't even compare it. So fresh is always best, I think, especially when it comes to stuff like herbs. Herbs or spices. Well, let's just say it's like stuff like ginger and herbs, for sure. You definitely want to stay fresh.
And I'm going to chime in on that. A couple things I like to use fresh is basil, rosemary, and ginger. Thyme too as well. If you haven't played around with berries and rosemary, there's something special there. And just to let the folks know on Facebook that we're paying attention, Josh Mahoney wanted me to put a shout out to the Valkyrie Horns mead competition. They're going to have a special Castamel category on there. So, hey, here's a mead comp where you can actually sing your spicy meads, and people are not going to put on there too hot. So there you go.
Nice. Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything we've used that we preferred dried, and I guess it would only be certain chili peppers, where the dried version, it also changes the type of chili. So yeah. Although, so let's see. Any other ingredients that you've found that are added in secondary? Do you have tips or tricks for specific to that ingredient? I'll throw out one. Coconut. I've found that toasting the coconut and getting it nice light and browned makes a world of difference. I don't do 100% toasted coconut, but we do about half, and it gives it more coconut flavor that lasts a little longer. We've found random ingredients. Anything else you guys have tips for?
I have one, and it's after a mead that one of my favorite from Melavino's, which is the Murder of the Crows. I love that mead, and I've been trying to duplicate it like for years. But one thing that I do that I think makes a huge difference for my version of it is I roast the black peppercorns on the stove, and I also take some and I smoke them for an hour on my smoker. And I think it gives that mead some great complexity. And even 3 years later, that black pepper is just still prominent in that mead. So I think toasting your black pepper and roasting it makes a big difference.
Yeah, stuff like that. Every time we make Murder of Crows, I purposely overdo the black pepper a little bit.
Yeah.
So when we first bottle it, it's like you definitely get like huge black pepper character, but it's still at a level where it's like, wow, that's still awesome, and not so over the top. Purposely do it because we do know that black pepper will fade, it will mellow out, but at the dosage that we put it in, it literally lasts for quite some time. Well, actually, we'll open up a bottle of my last one.
Yeah.
Or even one of my oldest ones, actually. How about that? Yeah, so I mean, yeah, there's certain things, if anything particular, I mean, there's certain ingredients, like just talking about black peppercorn. I grind them fresh. I don't throw the black peppercorns in whole.
Right.
I always put through a grinder. We have a commercial spice grinder here. Sometimes we actually just use our bulk commercial food processor. Actually, that I actually like a lot better because it'll kind of like crack the peppers open, but not necessarily fully grind them like a spice grinder would. That I like doing. So stuff like that, certain spices that I buy whole, I like to grind them fresh, or like at least break them open fresh, right before using them. Vanilla beans, there's so many. I've heard so many people use vanilla beans so many different ways. Some people say they just drop them in whole, they don't do anything. Some people say they use a pair of scissors and just snip them 1-inch segments. I literally I slice them lengthwise, cut them open like that. Some people scrape the caviar out of it. Yeah, for me, I'm like, I basically split them open lengthwise and I throw them in. Sometimes, if we're not going to put them in a bag in one of our tanks, for example, to easily remove them later, then I'll actually cut them into like little 1/2-inch pieces. That way, if it does settle to the bottom of my tank, it'll just come right out of the drain and be able to go easily through my pump. But besides that, just split them lengthwise and throw them in.
Yeah. Yeah. My tip on vanilla beans is just make sure you hide the receipt from your wife. That's it. So one last spice that I always get questions on, and then we'll move on. And we've done a lot of experimenting with is coffee. We've approached it all different ways. We even had a mead where we split it up into ground, steeped in secondary, whole beans steeped in secondary, and cold brew. And we brought it to a quaff meeting. There was about 70 people there, and the winner on aroma, it was about 50-50 cold brew and whole bean, and then the winner on flavor or taste was cold brew. So we've kind of created a process where we do, depending on the recipe we're going for, it's a mix of cold brew and whole bean in there for probably 18 to 20 hours at most. And that's where we found we get the best aroma, best flavor, and it lasts. It doesn't dissipate too quickly. What have you guys found with coffee?
Same thing. You kind of want to hit it from both angles for the flavor and aroma, for sure. I do the same thing for our coffee meads. Is basically, yeah, we brew the cold brew. I don't put any coffee through fermentation myself, but what I'll end up doing is for like our all night long it's our espresso infused mead. So over the top of that, because the cold brew isn't enough to get that full aroma that I really wanted. So whole beans always go in over the top of that as well. So I hit it from both angles. I think that's where we've had the most success using coffee, in my opinion. But I always do it in secondary as well versus primary.
I'll do a percentage of The primary must is cold brew, not the whole, but a percentage, probably no more than 30%. Then I'll use whole beans and secondary. But one of the best coffee meads I've ever had was Tap House. But Ash holds on to trade secrets like nobody else I know. He won't even give you like a little nugget. So one day I'm gonna get Ash drunk and I'm gonna find out how he makes his coffee mead.
Yeah, that's not that hard. He's coming out here in November, and we're gonna do a collab and recreate his Smoky Pete mead. So I'm pretty stoked on that.
Very cool.
Smoky Pete in California, that's gonna involve weed.
At least it should.
It should.
It may or
And
may
if
not.
you do,
Okay, so one more thing on tweaking meads and secondary blending. Have you guys done a lot of blending, whether it's a traditional meads or it's another type? And if so, do you have any tips for blending, or what do you look for when you're doing that?
This is the guy to answer that question.
I blend a lot. I do bench trials. Take that same approach to doing blending. I think if you look at beer, you look at wine, you look at cider, those guys have been blending for years. And I think if you don't explore blending, you're missing out on an important tool that you can have in your toolkit. If I have a sweet mead over here that I can add to this melomel that is going to give it not only the mouthfeel that I want, but also the honey aromatics that I need, I'm going to blend that. And I know some people look at it as a bad thing, but I think as an industry, we just need to get past that, because it's a technique that's been used in the wine industry for years. It's what makes a good, Petit Verdot is, to me, is what makes a good cab and sometimes a good Merlot, and without that Petit Verdot, that cab isn't what it's supposed to be. So if you look at look at you guys in California, if you start talking to those winemakers, they're blending barrels back and forth to come up with that unique profile of that particular vineyard. And it's definitely something that I think that you need to play around with if you got the mead on hand to be able to do it. So just don't take commercial mead and blend it with your own mead, because I did have somebody who tried to do that. That is cheating, and you need to be stabbed in the side of the neck.
We had a question on Facebook that I guess I'll ask you guys. What about adding oat or oatmeal characteristics? I would assume that's just easy as adding oatmeal, which we can't do, but Carvin can do. But do you guys know anything else about that? Tips?
The only way I've been able to do it, Billy, is using real oats.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And I know he's on Facebook because he's always on Facebook. Adam Thompson. He actually has an oatmeal raisin cookie mead that he won a Mazer Cup with, and I'm pretty sure that he added oats to that. But Adam can chime in on that. But I know I've done it, and I definitely get a lot of flavor when I use oats in the meat. That's the only way I've been able to do it. If anyone knows another way, I'm all ears.
All right.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to get oats or oatmeal other than just using straight oats.
One other question I skipped over was about fermentation, and it was about using Tosna for the Kavik. I don't know if I'm ever saying it right. Yeast. Is there any tweak to Tosna, or is it just like a high nutrient requiring yeast process on Tosna?
Robustly, he's actually done. He's experimented so much more.
Hold on, Sergio. Got a longer delay. Just a reminder, next 5 minutes, keep it on airplane mode. All right, Sergio, you're back, and we missed all of that. Sorry.
All right. This is what happens when you offer free Wi-Fi at your meadery, by the way. Anyway. So yeah, that was a question. The Vic East and Tasla. Yeah. Yeah, Carvin could actually answer this a lot more robustly, being that he's played around with this Vic East a lot more than I have. But I basically treat them, the 2 times that I've actually played around with it, I just treat them basically as an ale yeast. So if you go to if you actually use the Tasla calculator on meadmaderight.com, you just select the ale lager yeast. And it'll basically treat it as a high nutrient requirement yeast, being that, ale yeast normally basically have beers normally will always have all the nitrogen for the most part that they need in their wort for that yeast strain. But being that there's 0 malt, very low nitrogen content in any mead that you kind of put together, the most I've ever seen, and this isn't like a standard strength traditional, is normally about high 20s to 30 parts per million nitrogen, where you normally need 150 to 250, depending on where you're starting, at least. But I basically just treat it as a high nitrogen requirement yeast. And obviously, since it's
because I actually did a presentation on this particular, fermenting meads at high temperature. All the Vikings is high end. I do give it a little go firm at pitch, but I treat them all as high end. You'll get a lot of people who say that these yeasts smell. They do smell, but there's a difference between smelling and sulfur. Those, if it's not sulfur, those don't worry about those aromatics. They're going to clean up toward the end of fermentation, and that's what I tell folks. They're just going to clean up toward the end of fermentation. So I pitch that yeast 2 ways. If it's under 8%, I just pitch that yeast and I feed it a little bit of go firm. If I'm fermenting over 8%, I create a 1030 sugar, not sugar, excuse me, a 1030 honey water must starter. I put it on a stir plate for probably about 6 hours, feed it a little go firm, and then I pitch it. That's just the way I've done it through all my research for my presentation, and I've never had one stall out on me, and they all taste pretty good. And one thing I want to touch on, since we're touching on high fermentation, I strongly advise people to play around with high yeast fermentation. I know it's taboo. I know it's like the skateboarded kids over there who smoke dope over in a corner, but they're not all bad. I was one of those kids. We're not all bad. There's a lot of flavors up there. If you're doing the same thing all the time and expecting a different result, you're not going to get it. But there's some flavor profiles with fermenting meads at higher temperatures that you're just not going to get down in the low 60s. So just wanted to throw that out there too as well.
Yeah, I mean, and the only other point I have is to keep in mind when talking about the Beck yeast, if you're definitely going to be fermenting them in the upper temperature range like they're really meant to, like they really want to ferment in, the higher temperature you ferment, whether you're using the Beck yeast or not, is the quicker the yeast is going to go through the nitrogen that you give it. So you're going to need more nitrogen or higher nitrogen feedings the warmer you actually ferment it out. So it's good to just treat the Beck yeast for sure as a high nitrogen requirement yeast for sure.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, we're about out of time. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you guys want to throw out there? Right as it freezes. Hold on, Sergio. We got to get you back. All right, go.
All right. So number one, I'm gonna send you some money to get better internet connection.
Cool.
But no, I mean, I guess closing statement essentially. I mean, it always reminds me when you get like multiple mead makers together and answering questions or just talking to one another. It always reminds me of that saying. It's like, ask 5 mead makers a question, you get 12 different answers. It really, for me, it's like my whole thing, like I kind of touched upon earlier. It's like I have my standard practices, my protocols, different methods of doing the same things. But again, I always kind of look at it in a more individualistic approach to each recipe, right? So when I look at mead making, I don't look at, all right, I'm just going to make mead with this, I'm going to make mead with that. I kind of think about each recipe in particular and exactly what I want to get out of that recipe. And then I open up my toolbox, essentially, and pick out the methods and the practices that I'm going to use to get that final result. So that's one thing I always try to get across is when I get asked questions through Facebook or Mead Made Right, sometimes, I'll give the way I do it on Mead Made Right's podcasts. But I mean, at the end of the day, it really all comes down to the best answer that answers them all is it depends. It depends what you're going for, what you really want to get out of each recipe. And if you think about it that way, it becomes a lot easier because then that way you're not stuck in a rut of doing the same thing for every single recipe. There's, just like you and I, everybody's different. Every mead recipe is going to be different as well. So you don't treat everybody exactly the same way. You don't treat your mead exactly the same way. So always keep that in mind and try to think, I guess, more broadly in a more focused way. I think is the best way to kind of say it when you're designing recipes and thinking about what you want your mead to taste like when it's all done.
Cool.
So from my perspective, besides telling you to get better internet, let's see. If you want to be a better golfer, you got to go to the range. Yeah. If you want to be a better baseball player, you got to go out there and fill some balls and you got to get to the batting cage. You want to be a better mead maker, you got to practice. you got to make mead if that is your goal. Even being a mead judge, you still got to practice. I think that a lot of taste profiles out there are regional. I can pretty much tell what type of mead a person is going to like by what's their local meadery. And I can pretty much be like, here, taste this. You're probably going to like it. You got to get out there and explore. You got to get out there and practice the craft. And I know sometimes that is hard, but you got to practice if you want to be a better mead maker. I also want to say thank you to Sergio. Thank you to Billy. I hope both of you have record sales days. For everybody sitting out there in the audience, I want you to at least take 12 bottles of mead home to help these people not be broke. Because I can tell you, meaderies don't make that much money. You make more money as a sandwich shop. But there you go. And happy Mead Day to everyone. And once again, thank you guys for letting me be a part of the podcast. Awesome. Well, happy Mead Day to you guys. Thanks for hopping on. And we'll be talking to you guys soon. All right, cheers.